Hunters track a 900 lb ELK, but they find a Bigfoot burial ground instead. They thought they were chasing the biggest elk of their lives, an animal close to 900 pounds, deep in the Montana backcountry. 2 hunters, one a seasoned guide, the other fresh out of the service, pushed farther into the wilderness than they ever had before. At first, it was just massive hoof prints and fresh tree rubs. But then came the silence, the wood knocks, and a single blurred trail cam frame of something towering at the edge of Camp. What began as a once-in-a-lifetime hunt turned into a nightmare discovery. A hidden mound in the forest, stones and branches carefully placed, and inside, bones too. Large, too human-like to explain away, but when they brought help back, it was gone. No bones, no mound. No proof at all. So what did they really stumble on in those mountains? A trick of the mind, or evidence of something we were never meant to see? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I never thought I'd be writing this down, but recent events in the Bitterroot Range have left me with little choice. The memories of fall 2009 still haunt me, and maybe putting them to paper will help make sense of what happened. I've been guiding hunters through Montana's backcountry for over 20 years, but nothing in my experience prepared me for what my cousin and I encountered during that elk season. The morning of October 12th started like any other fall day in the Bitterroots. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight, and the first hints of dawn revealed frost coating our tent. My cousin Mark had just returned from his second tour in Afghanistan that summer, and when he called asking about an elk hunt, it seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. I hadn't seen him since he enlisted 6 years ago, and I was curious to see how military service had changed the kid who used to follow me around during family camping trips. The changes were obvious from the moment he arrived at my outfitting base in Hamilton. Gone was the gangly teenager. In his place stood a lean, focused soldier. His gear was meticulously organized, military surplus mostly, but well chosen for the environment. While he might have lacked specific hunting experience, his fieldcraft was impressive. I watched him navigate through difficult terrain with the same precision I'd developed over decades of guiding. "The elk sign is heavy this year," I told him over coffee that morning, spreading out my topographical map. "The rut's in full swing, and I've been tracking a particularly large herd moving through the higher elevations." I pointed to a remote drainage I knew well, though I'd been avoiding it lately for reasons I couldn't quite explain. "We can set up camp here, about 8 miles in. Should put us right in their path." Mark studied the map intently, already marking potential observation points and escape routes. Old habits from his training, I supposed. "Terrain looks challenging," he noted, "but nothing we can't handle. Weather forecast? Cold front moving in later this week. We've got a 3-day window before the snow hits." I didn't mention my growing unease about the location. After all, I was the experienced guide here. If something felt off, it was my job to know why. But the sign was too good to pass up, and Mark had traveled too far to settle for marginal hunting grounds. We spent that first day hiking in, our packs heavy with gear for an extended stay. Mark moved with the quiet efficiency I'd expect from someone with his training, though I noticed he kept scanning the ridgelines more than necessary for someone hunting elk. Old combat instincts die hard, I figured. "You've changed," I said during one of our breaks, passing him my canteen. "But you still have that same look when you're focused on something." He smiled slightly, accepting the water. "Afghanistan changes everyone, makes you pay attention to different things. Like how the birds suddenly go quiet, or when something just feels wrong." He paused, looking up at the towering pines. "But this feels right. Being back in these mountains, hunting with you, it's exactly what I needed." By late afternoon, we'd reached my planned campsite, a small clearing backed by a rock face, with good visibility of the surrounding draws. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun dipped behind the peaks, and the wind carried that sharp edge that always preceded the season's first serious snow. We set up camp efficiently, Mark falling into the routine as if we'd been doing this together for years. The elk sign was even better than I'd hoped. Fresh droppings, rubbed trees, and clear trails through the understory. Everything pointed to a successful hunt ahead, but as darkness settled over the Bitterroots, I couldn't shake a familiar sensation. One I'd experienced before in these mountains, but had always dismissed. It was the feeling of being watched, not by anything I could explain, but by something that knew these peaks far better than I did. I kept this to myself, though. Mark had come here for a normal hunt, and that's exactly what I intended to give. If only I'd known then what the next few days would bring. The morning of October 12th started like any other fall day in the Bitterroot Range. The air had that crisp bite that signals winter's approach, and frost coated the grass around our camp. My cousin Mike, fresh out of his third tour with the Army Rangers, was already up and checking our gear when I crawled out of my sleeping bag. We hadn't seen each other in almost 7 years, but some things never change. He was always the early riser. "Weather's perfect," he said, handing me a steaming cup of coffee. "Barometer's steady, winds coming from the northwest. Should be good for pushing into that drainage we talked about." I nodded, taking a careful sip. The coffee helped chase away the morning chill as we geared up. We'd chosen this particular area of the Bitterroots carefully. It was about 4 miles beyond where most hunters would venture, requiring a steep climb through some rough country. But I knew from experience that the bigger bulls often held up in these more remote pockets, especially during the rut. We started hiking just as first light was breaking over the ridgeline. The terrain was challenging, a mix of dense lodgepole pine stands and small meadows, with plenty of deadfall to navigate. About 2 hours in, Mike stopped abruptly, pointing to the ground. "Check this out," he whispered, kneeling beside a patch of soft soil near a seep. I moved closer, and immediately saw what had caught his attention. The elk tracks pressed into the mud were massive, significantly larger than what I typically saw from even the biggest bulls in the area. The prints were fresh, probably from earlier that morning, and sank deep into the earth. "Must be one hell of a bull," Mike said, placing his hand next to one of the tracks for scale. The print dwarfed his palm dot as we followed the sign. We found more evidence, fresh droppings that seemed oversized, even for an adult bull elk. But it was the tree rubs that really got our attention. Elk regularly rubbed their antlers on trees during the rut, but these marks were different. They started at chest height, which was unusual enough, but extended upward to nearly 8 feet off the ground. "I've never seen rubs this high," I admitted, running my hand over the stripped bark. "Not in 20 years of guiding." Mike circled one of the marked trees, his military training evident in how he systematically analyzed the sign. "The bark's still fresh underneath, see? And there's hair caught in these higher strips. Whatever did this, it was recent." We pushed further into unfamiliar territory, leaving the established game trails behind. The landscape grew increasingly rugged, with steep draws and thick patches of regenerating forest from an old burn. Every so often, we'd find more sign, another set of those unusually large tracks, more towering rubs, or beds in the grass that seemed too big for a typical elk dot. Our excitement grew with each discovery. Trophy bulls were getting harder to find these days, and all signs pointed to something exceptional. The morning passed quickly as we followed the trail, marking waypoints on our GPS and taking careful note of landmarks. "This has got to be the biggest bull in the Bitterroots," I said, examining another set of tracks. "Maybe even a state record if we can get on him." Mike nodded, but I noticed he seemed more focused on our surroundings than the sign itself. His eyes kept scanning the timber, and he'd pause occasionally to listen. I attributed it to his military training. Old habits die hard. By mid-morning, we'd pushed about 6 miles from camp, well beyond where most hunters would venture. The sign was getting fresher, and we began moving more carefully, checking the wind frequently and speaking only in whispers. Whatever we were tracking, it was using this remote pocket of wilderness as its sanctuary, and we were definitely in its territory now. I checked my watch, 12:15 in the afternoon. We'd been following promising elk sign for hours, working our way deeper into less traveled terrain. The massive tracks we'd found earlier had my cousin Mike excited, and I couldn't blame him. In my 15 years as an outfitter in these mountains, I'd rarely seen bull sign this impressive. The first thing that struck me was how suddenly the forest went quiet. 1 minute, Clark's nutcrackers were calling back and forth overhead. Red squirrels were chattering their complaints, and the next, nothing. The silence hit like someone had thrown a switch. Even the wind seemed to die in the towering lodgepole pines above us. Mike noticed it too. He stopped mid-stride, his boot crunching on fallen needles. "Birds got awful quiet," he whispered, more observation than concern. Military training had taught him to read his environment, but he didn't know these mountains like I did. "Yeah," I kept my voice low, scanning the timber around us. "Sometimes happens up here." The words felt thick in my throat. Truth was, I'd experienced this kind of dead silence before in this particular stretch of the Bitterroots, always in this same general area. Never could explain it properly in my guide logs. "Mountain lion, maybe?" Mike suggested, adjusting the rifle sling on his shoulder. His eyes swept the ridge above us, professional and precise. I shook my head slowly. Cats don't usually clear out an area this wide. Bears neither. I didn't mention that I'd guided cat hunters through here plenty. This silence was different. Deeper somehow. More absolute. We stood there for several long minutes, just listening. No wind in the trees, no birds, no squirrels. Even the usual background buzz of insects had vanished. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, though that might have been my imagination. "Want to turn back?" Mike asked, but I could tell from his tone he was hoping I'd say no. We'd been planning this hunt for months, and the sign we'd found was too good to ignore. I thought it over carefully. The rational part of my brain said we should retreat, come back another day. But I'd never actually encountered anything dangerous during these quiet spells, just the silence itself, lasting anywhere from minutes to hours before life returned to normal. "Let's press on," I decided finally, "but we'll take it slow. Stay close together." I didn't add that I wanted us within easy supporting distance of each other. Mike nodded, and I could see him shift into a more deliberate movement pattern, the way he'd learned in Afghanistan. We continued up the game trail, but our pace dropped to maybe half what it had been. Every step was considered now, testing for loose rocks or crackling twigs before committing our weight. The silence made every small sound we made seem thunderous. I found myself checking our back trail more often than usual, though I couldn't have said exactly why. The forest behind us looked normal enough. Tall pines, patches of autumn yellow aspen, scattered boulder fields. But something about the quality of the silence made the hair on my neck stand up. After about 20 minutes, Mike paused to take a drink from his canteen. "You said this has happened before?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unscrewing my own water bottle. 3 or 4 times over the years, always in this general area." I hesitated, then added, "It's part of why I usually stick to the western drainages." These days, he absorbed that, taking another slow sip. "But you've never seen anything unusual during these quiet spells?" "Nothing I could put in a report," I answered carefully. That was true enough, though it wasn't the whole truth. I'd seen things I couldn't explain, shadows that moved wrong, branches that seemed to bend against the wind. But nothing concrete. Enough to justify writing up. The silence held as we continued on, broken only by our own careful movements and occasional whispered comments. Every so often, I'd catch Mike looking over his shoulder too. The excitement of the morning's elk sign. had been replaced by something more watchful, more primal. We were still hunting, but now I wasn't entirely sure what was hunting, what that the silence that had descended during midday left us both on edge, though we tried not to show it. As the afternoon wore on, we pushed toward higher ground, looking for a decent spot to make camp. I'd learned long ago that camping near ridgelines gave better visibility and usually meant drier ground, especially this time of year when the low spots could get surprisingly soggy. "This looks good," I said, pointing to a relatively flat area, about 50 yards below the actual ridge. "We'll have some wind protection from those Douglas firs, but we're high enough to glass the opposite slope come morning." Mike nodded, already shrugging off his pack. The military had taught him efficiency, and I watched as he methodically began setting up his tent. The sun was getting low, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Temperature was dropping fast, typical for October in the Bitterroots. "You said you've guided in this area before?" Mike asked as he drove in his tent stakes. I hesitated before answering, testing the ground with my boot as I chose a spot for my own shelter. "Yeah, but not for a few years. Game patterns change, you know how it is." I didn't tell him I'd actively avoided this particular drainage. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when you can't explain them properly. We got camp squared away just as dusk really started settling in. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and we sat on fallen logs near our small camp stove, warming up cups of coffee. The forest had stayed quiet all afternoon, not completely silent like earlier, but subdued, different. Anyone who spent time in the mountains knows how they can feel welcoming one day and alien the next. This evening definitely felt like the latter. That's when we heard it, the first knock. A sharp wooden sound that carried clearly through the timber. Mike's head snapped up, coffee forgotten. "Other hunters?" he whispered, though we were probably too far out for anyone to hear us talking normally. I shook my head slowly. "Shouldn't be. We're miles from the nearest trailhead, and I didn't see any other vehicles at the access point." The knocking came. Again, this time answered by another knock from a different direction. The sounds were evenly spaced, deliberate, not like branches knocking together in the wind. And there wasn't any wind anyway. The evening was dead still. "Could be someone else set up camp we don't know about," Mike suggested, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. He'd spent enough time in the field to know this didn't feel right. 3 more knocks in quick succession, closer this time. Maybe 200 yards out, though distance can be tricky to judge in the failing light. I'd heard a lot of sounds in these mountains, elk bugling, bears huffing, cats screaming, but this was different. These knocks had weight to them, like someone hitting a thick tree trunk with a baseball bat. But who would be out here, in the growing dark, hitting trees? "Never heard anything quite like that," I admitted quietly, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sounds. They seemed to be moving, working in a rough semicircle around our position. Mike had his hand on his rifle, though he probably didn't even realize he was doing it. The knocking continued sporadically for the next 20 minutes as night settled in completely. Sometimes it would sound far off, echo-like through the timber, then suddenly seem much closer. There was a pattern to it that I couldn't quite grasp, like listening to a conversation in a language you don't understand, but recognizing it as communication all the same. "Should we answer?" Mike whispered at one point, half reaching for his pack where he had a trekking pole. "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with how quickly and decisively I responded. "Whatever's making those sounds, let's not invite it closer." We sat in tense silence as the knocking gradually moved further away, finally fading into the darkness to our east. Neither of us mentioned how the sounds had started up right around the time we'd made camp, or how they seemed to have circled our position before moving off. Some things are easier left unspoken when you're miles from anywhere, with nothing but canvas between you and whatever's out there in the dark. We got our small camp set up just before dusk settled in completely. Mike had insisted on setting up our trail camera on a sturdy pine about 20 yards from camp, angling it to catch any movement along the game trail we'd been following. "If that monster bull comes through here tonight, I want proof," he'd said, testing the camera's trigger with a wave of his hand. I got a modest fire going while Mike heated up our freeze-dried meals. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness beyond our little circle of light seemed unusually thick. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and the wind was picking up, coming in irregular gusts that rattled the branches overhead. It was during one of these gusts that I caught the first whiff of it, a smell that made my nose wrinkle involuntarily. "You smell that?" I asked Mike, who was stirring his beef stroganoff with a titanium spork. He looked up, sniffing. "Yeah. Dead elk, maybe, or a bear's kill." I shook my head slowly. "Different. More like," I struggled to find the right words, "like wet fur and something rotten, but not quite decay." The smell came and went with the wind, but each time it returned, it seemed stronger, more distinct. Around 9:30, we decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to coals, and we'd need to be up before dawn if we wanted to catch first light. I was just zipping up my sleeping bag when I heard it, the sound of something heavy moving through the brush, just beyond where our firelight reached. "Mike?" I whispered. "I hear it," he replied from his tent, his voice barely audible. The movement continued, deliberate and slow, making a complete circuit around our camp. Whatever it was big enough to push through the undergrowth without much effort. I thought about reaching for my rifle, but something held me back. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the way the thing moved, not like any animal I'd guided hunters to before. The circuit continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes the movement would stop completely, and in those moments, the silence was absolute. No crickets, no night birds, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional pop from our dying fire. Around midnight, I heard Mike unzip his tent slightly. "Trail cam's going to catch whatever this is," he whispered across to me. I'd almost forgotten about the camera, and the thought gave me some comfort. At least we'd have evidence of what was out there, even if it turned out to be just a curious. The wind picked up again around 2 in the morning, bringing with it that same foul odor, stronger than before. It was almost overwhelming this time, and I pulled my sleeping bag up over my nose. The movement outside had stopped, but I could feel something, a presence. Like when you know someone's staring at you even though you can't see them. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, early morning light was filtering through my tent walls. The air was crisp and clean, with no trace of the previous night's smell. I heard Mike moving around outside and unzipped my tent to join him. "Sleep much?" he asked, already working on getting a morning fire started. The dark circles under his eyes answered his own question. "Not really," I admitted, reaching for the coffee in my pack. "You want to check the trail cam?" Mike nodded, and we walked over to the pine where we'd mounted it. The camera was exactly as we'd left it, its small red light blinking to show it was still working. Mike pulled out the memory card and inserted it into his digital viewer. We huddled around the small screen, flipping through the night's images. There were a few triggered by the wind-moving branches, some showing nothing but darkness. But what struck me most was what we didn't see. No glowing eyes reflecting the infrared flash. No large shapes moving through frame, nothing to explain. The heavy footsteps we'd heard circling our camp all night. "Maybe it stayed just out of range," Mike suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, but something about those empty frames bothered me more than if we'd actually caught something on camera. It felt deliberate somehow, like whatever had been out there knew exactly where to walk to avoid being photographed. I woke before sunrise, my sleeping bag damp with morning dew. The fire had died to embers hours ago, and the cold Montana air bit through my layers. Mike was already up, methodically packing his gear with that military precision that hadn't left him since his discharge. Neither of us had slept well. The night had been punctuated by that persistent, nauseating odor that seemed to come and go with the wind. "Let's check the camera," Mike said, his breath visible in the pre-dawn light. "I want to see if our elk moved through during the night." I nodded, though something in my gut told me we wouldn't find what we were hoping for. 20 years of guiding in these mountains had taught me to trust those instincts. We made our way to the pine where we'd mounted the trail camera, our boots crunching through frost-covered grass. The camera was exactly as we'd left it, secured firmly to the trunk about chest height. Mike reached up and detached it, his fingers working quickly despite the cold. The LCD screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow on our faces in the dim morning light. "One trigger," Mike muttered, thumbing through the menu. "Around 2:15 in the morning." I leaned in closer as he pulled up the image. What I saw made my stomach tighten. The photo was grainy, taken in infrared, but it showed something standing at the edge of our camera's range. Whatever it was, it wasn't an elk. What the hell? Mike zoomed in, but it only made the image more unclear. The figure was broad-shouldered, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, standing upright between two large pines. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, and the way it seemed to be facing directly toward our camp made the hair on my neck stand. "Up. Could be another hunter," I suggested, though I knew better. No hunter would be creeping around our camp at 2 in the morning, and none could explain that height. Mike shook his head. "No way. Look at the size comparison to those trees. Unless someone's walking around out here on stilts," he trailed off, studying the image with intense focus. "Could be a shadow, maybe? Or something closer to the camera, making it look bigger." "Maybe," I said, but we both knew we were reaching for explanations that didn't fit. I'd seen plenty of trail cam photos over the years, of elk, bears, mountain lions, trespassing hunters. This was something else entirely. "We should push forward," Mike said, already slipping the camera back into his pack. "Whatever this is, it's gone now, and those elk tracks from yesterday were heading up toward the ridge. We've got good light, perfect weather for tracking." I found myself shaking my head before he finished speaking. "Mike, I think we need to consider heading back. Something's not right up here." I hesitated, not wanting to sound superstitious to my former Army cousin. I've guided these mountains for 2 decades. When things feel off, there's usually a good reason. "Come on, John." Mike's voice took on an edge of frustration. "We've come all this way. You saw those tracks yesterday. That's a once-in-a-lifetime bull. We can't turn back because of one weird photo." I looked up at the ridgeline ahead of us where thin morning mist still clung to the trees. The forest felt different now, like we'd crossed some invisible boundary. Even the morning birds seemed subdued, their calls fewer and farther between than they should have been. "Your call," Mike said, shouldering his pack. "But I didn't come all the way out here to turn back when we're this close." The unspoken challenge hung in the air between us, the seasoned guide backing down while the younger man pushed forward. I ran my hand over my face, feeling the morning stubble and trying to think clearly. 20 years of experience was screaming at me to turn around, but I also knew I couldn't let Mike continue alone. Whatever was up here, whatever had triggered that camera in the night, it was better to face it together. "We'll keep going," I said finally. "But we do it smart. We stay together, we keep aware, and we turn back at the first sign of real trouble." Mike nodded, but I could see the relief in his expression. He was already focused on the hunt again, while my mind kept returning to that blurred figure in the photo, standing in the darkness, watching our camp. I pulled the SD card from the trail camera with trembling fingers, dreading what we might find. The morning air was bitter cold, and my breath came out in thick clouds as Mike huddled next to me, both of us squinting at the small LCD screen on the back of the camera. "Just cycle through them," Mike urged, his military training evident in his controlled tone despite the tension. There were only 8 triggers during the night. The first few images showed nothing, just wind-moved branches in the infrared glow. Then my thumb froze on the 4th image. There, at the edge of the frame, stood something that made my stomach drop. The figure was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and though the image was blurred by motion, there was no mistaking its bipedal stance. That's got to be someone messing with us, Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe other hunters? I shook my head slowly. No other camps within 5 miles of here. You know that. And look at the height comparison to that Douglas. Fur behind it, whatever this is, it's well over 7 feet tall. We studied the image in silence for a long moment, before Mike straightened up. Well, we came here to hunt. The elk sign is good. I say we push on. I wanted to argue, to tell him about the other times I'd felt this way in these mountains, about the areas I'd quietly marked off my guiding map over the years. But 20 years of reputation as a reliable outfitter held my tongue. Instead, I nodded and shouldered my pack. We climbed higher into the range, following game trails that wound through stands of lodgepole pine. The morning sun barely penetrated the canopy, leaving us in a perpetual twilight. About 2 hours into our hike, we came across something that stopped us both in our tracks. Several large logs, each at least 8 inches in diameter, had been leaned together in a crude teepee-like structure. The formation stood nearly 12 feet tall, and what struck me most was the deliberate nature of it. These weren't trees that had fallen naturally. Storm damage? Mike suggested, but he was already circling the structure, his military training evident in how he scanned the surrounding area. No storm did this, I said quietly. Look at how the bark's been stripped from these trunks. And see how they're wedged together at the top? That took strength and purpose. As if to emphasize my point, we discovered 2 more similar structures within the next 100 yards. Each one seemed more deliberately constructed than the last. The third one had smaller branches woven between the main supports, creating a crude shelter. Could be old hunting blinds, Mike offered, but we both knew better. No hunter would go to this much effort, especially not this far from any accessible trails. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. Every snapping twig in the forest around us made us turn our heads. The usual mountain ambient sounds, birds, squirrels, wind in the trees, seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I caught Mike checking his rifle more frequently, making sure a round was chambered. I did the same, though I couldn't shake the feeling that our weapons might be useless against whatever was out there. We should mark these on the GPS, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. Document the locations. I nodded, but as I reached for my GPS unit, a deep crack echoed through the trees, the sound of a massive branch breaking somewhere behind us. We both spun around, rifles instinctively coming up to our shoulders. The forest had gone completely silent. Through the trees, about 80 yards back, something dark moved. It was just a shadow, a suggestion of movement, but it was enough to make my heart race. Whatever it was big, and it was moving parallel to our trail, keeping pace with us through the timber. You see that? Mike whispered. Yeah, I breathed. Let's keep moving, but stay close. We pressed on, but now every step felt watched, every movement observed. The crude structures around us no longer seemed like curious discoveries. They were markers, warnings perhaps, that we were entering something's territory. Something that was smart enough to build, strong enough to move massive logs, and patient enough to stay just out of clear sight. The elk tracks led us down into a narrow valley where the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and that's when the first bone caught my eye, bleached white against the dark soil. Mike, I whispered, pointing. He nodded, already seeing what I saw. It wasn't just one bone. As our eyes adjusted, To the gloom, we could make out dozens, maybe hundreds of bones scattered across the forest floor. But there was something wrong about their arrangement. "These aren't random," Mike muttered, crouching down to examine a set of deer antlers crossed perfectly with what looked like a coyote's skull. "Someone, or something, placed these here." He was right. The bones weren't scattered by scavengers or natural decay. They were arranged in distinct patterns, some stacked in neat piles, others forming crude geometric shapes. I recognized fragments from elk, deer, and even what appeared to be mountain lion remains. All had been stripped. Completely clean, not a scrap of tissue remaining. The smell hit us then, a thick, musty odor that seemed to coat the back of my throat. It was similar to the stench from last night, but stronger here, more permanent. This wasn't just a passing scent. This was territory marked by something that lived here. The silence in this valley was absolute. No wind rustled the leaves above. No birds called. Even our boots seemed muffled on the damp earth, as if the very ground was absorbing sound. 20 years of guiding in these mountains, and I'd never experienced anything like this oppressive quiet. "Look at these marks," Mike said, his voice barely above a breath as he examined a large elk femur. "These aren't tooth marks from any predator." "I know. They're too uniform, almost like..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The marks looked deliberate, methodical, like something had used tools to strip the bones. I'd seen enough butchered game to know these weren't the random scoring patterns left by wolves or bears. We stood in that valley of bones, our elk hunt forgotten as the reality of our situation slowly sank in. We weren't tracking game anymore. We were standing in something's larder. The sky darkened rapidly and thunder rolled across the ridges. Marcus and I had barely made it halfway back up the valley slope when the first heavy drops began to fall. We found shelter beneath a dense stand of spruce trees, their branches providing some cover from the intensifying downpour. "Let's check the GPS," Marcus said, pulling his unit from his vest pocket. "We need to make sure we're heading in the right direction when this passes." I retrieved my own GPS, but something was wrong. The screen showed only static, then went black. I pressed the power button several times, but nothing happened. "Mine's dead too," Marcus reported, frowning at his device. "Battery was full this morning." "That's impossible," I muttered, checking my backup compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on north. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. We waited 30 minutes for the worst of the storm to pass, then started moving again. The valley behind us had disappeared into a wall of gray rain, but something about our path felt wrong. I'd been guiding these mountains for 2 decades, and I knew how to read terrain. Yet every ridge we crossed, every drainage we followed, seemed to curve back toward that bone-filled valley. "This can't be right," I said, stopping to study our surroundings. "We should be heading due east, but look at those rock formations." "We've seen them before." Marcus wiped rain from his face. "You're saying we're going in circles?" "Not circles exactly. It's like..." I struggled to find the words. "Like the land itself is funneling us back. Every time we try to move away, the terrain forces us to turn. Notice how the game trails all seem to lead down." Another rumble of thunder emphasized my words. The rain had soaked through our gear, and the temperature was dropping. Without working GPS units, and with the compass acting strange, we were running out of options. "We need to make a decision," Marcus said. "Either we push through this weird zone, or we find somewhere defensible to wait it out." Before I could respond, that now familiar silence descended again, somehow noticeable even through the steady drumming of rain on leaves. The forest around us felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The rain had finally let up when we stumbled upon it, what looked at first like a natural hill, maybe 20 feet across and half as high. But as we got closer, I could see where recent rains had carved away one side, revealing something that made blood run cold. Branches and stones had been deliberately placed in layers, forming what looked like a crude burial chamber. "Marcus, we need to go," I said, but my cousin was already moving closer, his military training seemingly forgotten in the face of this discovery. The erosion had exposed an opening about 4 feet high, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself following him. "Look at this construction," he whispered, pulling out his waterproof notebook. "These aren't random fallen branches. Something stacked these intentionally." His pen moved quickly across the paper, sketching the layout. I played my flashlight beam into the cavity, immediately wishing I hadn't. Partially embedded in the earthen wall were bones, not scattered like the ones we'd found in the valley, but carefully arranged. A massive femur protruded from the dirt, easily half again as long as a human's. Next to it, partially obscured by roots and soil, was what could only be a skull. The shape was wrong, too large, too robust, with heavy brow ridges that reminded me of prehistoric human remains I'd seen in museums but scaled up to an impossible size. "We need to document this," Marcus insisted, his hands shaking slightly as he continued taking notes. This might be. This is us leaving." I cut him off, grabbing his arm. "Right now." The silence around us had grown deeper. If that was possible, and the musty odor we'd noticed earlier was stronger here. Fresh. Close. "Just let me finish these measurements," he protested, but I was already pulling him away from the mound. 20 years of guiding had taught me when a situation had gone from unusual to dangerous, and every fiber of my being was telling me we'd crossed that line. "Whatever made this might still be around," I said quietly, scanning the tree line. "And I don't think we want to meet it." The rain made our retreat treacherous, turning the forest floor into a slick mess of pine needles and mud. We tried following our original tracks, but the water was already washing them away. Marcus kept checking his compass, though I could tell by his furrowed brow that something wasn't adding up. The first knock came from our left, a sharp crack that cut through the drumming rain. Before I could convince myself it was just a falling branch, another answered from the right, too precise, too intentional. Marcus and I exchanged glances, our earlier scientific curiosity replaced by primal fear. "Those elk tracks, Marcus," whispered, pointing to where we'd been following the massive bull. "They just stop." He was right. The clear prints we'd been trailing now ended abruptly at the burial mound, as if the animal had simply vanished into thin air. No diverging path, no signs of struggle, just nothing. The sound of rocks tumbling down the slope made us both jump. I swung my rifle toward the noise, but the rain-soaked vegetation revealed nothing. More stones clattered down the opposite hillside, creating a disorienting effect, like we were being herded. "We need markers," I said, pulling bright orange surveyor's tape from my pack. I'd started carrying it years ago after getting turned around in a whiteout. Something to find our way back if we need to. Marcus nodded, helping me tie strips to branches at eye level. We moved faster now, the knocking sounds maintaining their distance, but never fully fading. The tape fragments fluttered behind us. Like desperate flags, their orange brightness already dimming in the growing darkness. "What if we can't find our way out?" Marcus's voice was barely audible above the rain. I didn't answer. The truth was, these mountains felt different now, altered somehow by what we'd discovered. The familiar landmarks I'd used for years seemed to shift and blur, as if the land itself was conspiring to keep us lost. More rocks crashed through the undergrowth, closer this time. We picked up our pace, the orange markers becoming our lifeline in an increasingly hostile wilderness. Behind us, somewhere in the gray curtain of rain, something moved with purpose through the trees. The first rays of dawn broke through the trees, and I nearly wept at the sight of Sawmill Ridge. We'd somehow made it back to familiar territory, though neither of us could explain how. My legs trembled with exhaustion, and Marcus looked as haunted as I felt, his military composure finally cracking. "We need to report this," he said, leaning against a pine trunk to catch his breath. "That burial site, those remains weren't natural. Someone needs to investigate." I shook my head, remembering the last time strange stories had circulated in town. 3 years ago, a respected rancher had reported similar structures on his property, those same crude timber formations we'd seen. The ridicule had been merciless. He'd sold his land within 6 months and moved to Idaho. "They won't believe." "US," I said, my voice hoarse from the night's exertion. "You know how these things go. We'll be the joke of every bar from here to Missoula." Marcus pulled out his waterproof notebook, flipping through the hasty sketches he'd made of the burial. "Mound, we have evidence. Measurements, coordinates once the GPS starts working again. Those bones weren't from any known species, and the arrangement wasn't natural." I watched him page through his notes, seeing the determination in his eyes. The military had trained him to report and document, to follow procedure. But I knew these. Mountains knew the people. They preferred their mysteries unexplained, their legends safely contained in campfire stories. Still, looking at his face, I realized he wouldn't let this go. Maybe he couldn't. What we'd seen had changed something fundamental in both of us. "Fine," I conceded, checking my rifle's magazine more out of habit than necessity. "We'll talk to the Forest Service first, then the county sheriff if we have to. But we do this carefully. No wild claims, just the facts we can prove." Marcus nodded, relief visible in his shoulders. "That's all I'm asking. Someone needs to know what's up there." I didn't tell him I was already dreading the conversations ahead, the skeptical looks, the barely concealed smirks. Some things, I was beginning to understand, were better left undisturbed in these mountains. 2 days later, we led Sheriff Thompson and Forest Ranger Martinez back up the trail. My boots felt like lead, each step bringing us closer to what I knew would be a futile exercise. Marcus walked beside me, his notebook clutched tightly, while the officials followed with barely concealed impatience. "How much further?" Thompson called out, his voice carrying that edge of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I'd known him for 15 years. He was a good lawman, but firmly rooted in what he considered possible. "Just over this rise," I answered, pointing to the familiar slope. The morning was crisp, nothing like the oppressive atmosphere we'd experienced 2 days ago. Birds sang, squirrels chattered. Everything seemed normal. When we reached the burial mound site, my heart sank. Where there had been a distinct earthen rise with carefully arranged stones and branches, now lay nothing but a shallow depression in the ground. The cavity that had housed those massive bones was collapsed, filled with fresh soil and debris as if a recent rainfall had washed everything away. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale. It was right here. The bones were right here. He flipped through his notebook frantically. "I have the measurements, the sketches." Ranger Martinez knelt by the hollow, prodding the dirt with a gloved hand. "Looks like a typical bear cache to me. They'll sometimes bury larger kills. Come back later to feed." She stood, brushing off her hands. "The recent storm probably caused this erosion." "Bears don't stack bones in patterns," Marcus protested. "And those structures we saw, the timber formations." Sheriff Thompson cut him off with a wave. "Son, I've been dealing with bear activity reports for 20 years. They can be mighty particular about their feeding sites." He pulled out his notepad, already writing. "I'll mark this as a disturbed bear cache, standard wildlife interaction." I watched Marcus's face fall as the officials started their trek back down the mountain, clearly considering the matter closed. The timber structures we'd passed on our way up were gone too. No crossed logs, no stripped bark. Nothing to suggest anything unusual had ever happened here. The forest had erased every trace of what we'd seen, leaving us with nothing but our memories and a few cryptic notes that suddenly seemed inadequate even to me. On the hike back, I caught fragments of conversation between the sheriff and Ranger Peterson. Their voices carried just enough for me to make out their doubts. "Probably got spooked by a grizzly," the sheriff muttered. Then their imagination ran wild with it. The ranger nodded, adjusting his pack. "Stress does funny things to people in the backcountry. Even experienced ones start seeing patterns that aren't there." I watched Marcus's jaw clench tighter with each dismissive comment. He'd pulled out his notebook again, flipping through pages of detailed observations, sketches, and coordinates that now seemed to mock us. 20 years of military service had taught him to document everything, but what good were field notes when the evidence itself had vanished? "They're treating us like we're crazy," he whispered fiercely. "You saw it too. Those weren't random fallen trees. Something intelligent arranged those structures. And those bones," he shook his head. "This wasn't natural, and you know it." Something cleared that site deliberately. I couldn't disagree, but the weight of what that meant settled heavy in my gut. Whatever was up there had not only intelligence but purpose. It had let us find its sacred ground, then ensured we'd never prove it existed. The sheriff fell back to walk beside me. "Look," he said, his tone carefully diplomatic, "I know you're a respected guide in these parts, but making claims about giant skeletons and mysterious structures, it could affect your business. Might be better to let this one go." The warning was clear enough. I nodded slowly, already knowing I'd never guide another hunt in this range. Some places weren't meant for us to understand, and this valley had made that abundantly clear. Marcus was still arguing with the ranger about track measurements and bone dimensions when we reached the trailhead. But I could see in the ranger's face that he'd already filed us away as another case of wilderness-induced paranoia. Our credibility was shot, and any future reports we might make would be tainted by this one. Recording date, October 15th, 2019. Been 10 years since that day in the Bitterroot Range, but I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, the sound of those knocks echoing in my mind. 3 tours in Afghanistan didn't leave me as shaken as those 4 days in Montana. I'm recording this now because someone needs to know. The official report lists it as a possible bear cache with misidentified remains. But I know what we saw. Those weren't elk bones. That wasn't a natural formation. And that skull, God, that skull. I've sketched it dozens of times, trying to capture the dimensions, the strange ridge structure. No known species matches it. The dream started about a month after we left. Always the same. I'm back in that valley, but this time I'm alone. The timber structures loom overhead, and I can feel eyes on me from every direction. Sometimes I hear the knocks getting closer. Sometimes it's just that oppressive silence. But I always wake up with the same certainty. We weren't meant to find that place. I've gone through my notes obsessively, comparing them with Native American burial practices, archaeological findings, even cryptozoological reports. Nothing quite matches what we encountered. The systematic arrangement of the bones, the deliberate construction of those wooden structures. It spoke of intelligence, of purpose. The outfitter, my cousin, he won't talk about it anymore. Hasn't guided in the Bitterroot since. Last time I brought it up, he just shook his head and said, "Some things in those mountains want to stay hidden." Maybe he's right. Maybe there are places in this world where the unknown still holds dominion, where ancient secrets lie buried beneath moss and memory. But I need whoever's listening to understand. If you're hunting, if you're tracking game, and the forest goes quiet, if you start finding structures that shouldn't be there, if the land itself seems to be leading you somewhere, turn back. Some tracks aren't meant to be followed. Some discoveries come with a price. I learned that in Montana, and I'll carry that knowledge and these dreams to my grave. End of recording. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.